Hello, I'm Judy Stiles. Thank you for joining us this week on Newsmakers. Well, this week my special guest is Dr. Conrad Gubera with the Missouri Southern Sociology Department, and we're talking to him because, of course, the Middle East continues to be a lot in the news, and he has firsthand experience recently of a visit to Saudi Arabia. I'd like to thank you for being here today.
Thanks, Judy.
I know Saudi Arabia is one of those places we hear a lot about, so I appreciate you taking time today to share some information with our audience, but probably one of the first questions people have is, how did you get a trip to Saudi Arabia?
Oh, isn't that amazing? Everything paid for by the National Council on U.S. Arab Relations. It's a group I belong to in Washington, D.C. They have about 200 college professors. We're all called fellows. And as a result, they rotate with various trips throughout the Middle East and certainly all of the Arab world for these 200 fellows. And this time over Christmas, they had a 17-day trip to Saudi Arabia. Compliments of the Ministry of Education in Saudi Arabia, who footed the entire bill. Now, we were asked, for instance, to write reports from the outside about Saudi Arabia, but more than anything else, to come back to Missouri Southern and do a television program on it, and to teach it in some of my classes. And I will later on, I think, do a program on Islam as far as the regional Catholic school is concerned, kind of fulfill my obligations. The mainstay of the National Council, as developed, for instance, by an American, is to represent the Arab world and the Arab countries to America so they have a better view of what the Arab countries are like, and certainly the Arab countries divvy up money and they help support this. And the CEO of the National Council on U.S. Arab Relations was the Gokul speaker in 2011 when we had the Egypt semester. And he came here to Southern and just enjoyed himself immensely, Dr. John Duke Anthony, and delivered the Gokul series lectures.
So, of course, Saudi Arabia being right in the heart of the Arab world, the Middle East, we hear so much happening over there. This is a very timely visit for you to be in that part of the world.
I can't tell you how timely it is. I learned so much this, as I told my colleagues in the Department of Social Sciences, this last trip I ever take, it by far, perhaps maybe is one of the best. Unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of action. We had meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting with universities and business, refineries, certainly with religious leaders, and of course we kicked off the very first day of a half-a-day meeting at the American Embassy. Tremendous briefing for about 7 of the different chiefs of staff, plus of course the American ambassador who meted us and they greeted us, for instance, and really laid out a beautiful thing. By the way, he has his PhD from the University of Missouri. He was a Missouri boy. And so that really struck it off nicely as far as he and I were
local
concerned.
Ties, regional ties there. Well, let's start off. I know you have a lot of pictures, but I know you have a map. And of course, people think about the Middle East, but if we can call up some of our pictures that we have, and we'll start off by talking about Saudi Arabia and its location and the country itself.
Oh my, isn't that a wonderful? This map I took a picture of, for instance, in the, well, it's in the Saudi Museum, the Historical Museum. It's not a good map, but it's a map that's on parchment. Only Allah would know how old it is. But we have 3 destinations in Saudi Arabia. In the middle part, Riyadh. Now, that's the center of Saudi Arabia. And that's the old, oasis and kind of the camping grounds of the Saudis. That was where the Saudi tribe lived, in Riyadh. And of course, when they began to expand and took in with the Wahhabis about 200 years ago, and eventually their idea was to unify all of the tribes as far as Arabia was concerned under the Saudis. And in 1932, they declared themselves Saudi Arabia, the only Arab country in the world to be named after a tribe, the Saudi tribe, see? And so this is a remarkable history story in and of itself. We went from Riyadh to the Gulf Coast, which is the Persian Gulf. We used to call it, now they call it the Arabian Gulf, to a city called Bahrain. Bahrain is one of the leading export areas as far as, certainly, of course, loading tankers and sending oil through the Gulf, around the, certainly, of course, the Strait of Hormuz, back up through the Red Sea and through the Suez Canal, Mediterranean, certainly through the, Gibraltar area, and then out to the Atlantic, to the United States or wherever. And so as a result, they wanted us to see Bahrain, and there we had our no share of refineries. Of course, we can't take pictures of refineries, can't take pictures of, the embassy or anything like that, but nevertheless, for instance, just being there. There's a good picture of the back end of the embassy, for instance, and I'm taking it as I'm leaving, and fortunately that's a reflection of the sun, but nevertheless, we have a splendid embassy, embassy facilities. And of course, one of the things that gets my attention, and anyone who goes there, is the architecture. Right there in Riyadh. Look at what they're doing with buildings. I mean, that's a costly building.
Really
look at the curvature.
Innovative approaches to building something.
Architecture is unreal. The interesting thing is that a quarter of their architects are women, if not 30%. That's something that's surprising. Egypt is nearly 50%. We might pause at this picture just a second because we're just a little bit ahead of it, but after we left the embassy, and by the way, I didn't finish, for instance, the third city that we'll look at later on, not in this program, is the city of Jeddah. And that's about 40 kilometers. It opens us up, for instance, to Mecca. And as a result, Jeddah, which literally means grandmother, literally in the Arab world, this is leads to Mecca. And in Jeddah, which is on the west side of Saudi Arabia, and that sits on the Red Sea.
So it's on the other side.
It's on the other side, so we got both the Gulf area and then the Red Sea area and then the capital, in Riyadh. So they treated us rather well, but we didn't get to see too much because we were always going to meetings, briefings, attending universities, going to medical centers, hospitals. It was really quite an experience as far as certainly showing us what they had, for instance, and certainly getting us to comment on it.
A lot of information gathered through those visits.
Tremendous amount, and I think that was their objective because all of us are college professors, and their idea as far as the Arab world is certainly to come into colleges and provide, for instance, courses like the Arab World, which I teach, and certainly sponsor the Model Arab League, which we participated in this college since 1992 consecutively every year. We'll be going to Texas A&M later on in April this year, and certainly, of course, becoming more aware and enlivened by the local issues, the new issues, the ever-unfolding issues as far as the Arab world is concerned. We represent Iraq this year when we go to the Model Arab League.
Missouri Southern's
So
representing.
the first time we can actually, we don't have to pretend like we know something because we don't know anything, neither does Iraq. Right. So we can really be in character this time, and I feel comfortable representing Iraq this time, to say the least.
Are you finding that more of your students are becoming interested in the Middle East with everything?
They're becoming interested in the Middle East, but they're as confused as if you'd been at the Middle East desk for the last 40 years in the Pentagon, or certainly in the State Department, because they don't know any more than I what's happening, but they are unfolding, and ISIS and all of this, it's frantic. I mean, what ISIS does catches everyone's attention.
So all of these terrorist attacks and everything, people are wondering what's the future.
Let me tell you, no one is more frightened of this than the Saudis themselves are more concerned about it. And they're beginning to take initiatives, for instance, we'll discuss later on in other programs, perhaps maybe, as far as security and defense work that they've never done before. And certainly one of the things that certainly the public doesn't know is that since 2010, 2011, the Saudis have purchased over $72 billion of military hardware from the United States, along with services and along, for instance, with training programs from the United States. Just $72 billion alone in military.
So we have a very close association with them in the defense.
They want to be with us all the time. And unbeknownst to most people, there was a Saudi delegation accompanying our Secretary of State, John
Kerry?
Yeah, Mr. Kerry, John Kerry, for instance, in these negotiations with Iran regarding the nuclear...
The development of their nuclear power.
Anything we do with Iran, Saudi wants to be in on it because they see Iran as the real nemesis to that part of the world. They do not trust them. They're the ancient Persians. And as a result, any deal that the United States makes, we have to take Saudi Arabia into consideration with our negotiations with Iran. Now, people don't generally know that, but that's just an accomplished fact because the Saudis have been indisputably very much, for instance, associated with America for years, thanks to King Abdul Aziz and, of course, President Roosevelt back in the 1940s after the Potsdam Conference. But the Saudis are very concerned about what's happening in the Middle East. They're very concerned about what's happening in the Arab world. They do not want to have the mantle of leadership that's been cast on them. But with the fall of Egypt and Libya and these other countries, and of course the civil war in Syria, and God knows what's happening in Iraq, the Saudis have been put in this position.
So they are the remaining stable state, basically.
They are the stable state. They want to remain the stable state. And more than that, they've reconstructed the GCC, the Gulf Coast Cooperation Council, because this is a union now of royalty. Every one of those countries have a kingship, and they think that the kingship and the royal families anchor the Arab world, and particularly the Middle East, and they are not interested in democracy. They're not interested in representative government. They want to hold the line, for instance, with the leadership which comes, for instance, from royal families. And the GCC, every one of them is a kingship. They're going to see that that remains. And frankly, most of the people in Saudi Arabia, the vast majority of them, think that's all right.
They accept that type of
Yes,
leadership in their country and so forth. Well, we have some more pictures.
Oh,
So
sure.
let's take a look back. We have an interesting book being shown here.
Well, yeah, if we could, I'd like to back this up just a little bit, because there we go, and even one more. Ah, that's a good shot. You know, we go from the embassy into King Faisal's Islamic Center. It's right across and down the street in Riyadh. And those women there are our American delegation. And the women had to wear the hijab and certainly put on all of the coverings, and we men always had to dress in dark suits, and that was a request by the Saudi government that American women don't dress American, that they dress, for instance, in traditional style.
Match the culture you're visiting.
Match the culture we're visiting it. And so we have to go back into this ancient kind of, bodysuit, or certainly, of course, style, but in the face of this remarkable architecture that's around you, that is about as modern as anything you're going to see. Right. And again, it's full of such incongruities because we, on one hand, to remain simple and not flashy. On the other hand, my gosh, you never see the architectures you're going to see, or I'll show you, as far as Saudi Arabia is concerned.
So the Islamic Center focuses on the Islamic
Islam,
history.
yeah. Take a look at that. I mean, you know, of course, that's the all-seeing eye halfway up there, but I mean, that doesn't serve too much of a really good purpose, except it's the Islamic Center, and this architecture is just there. I mean, there is so much wealth, it seems like, that it's almost flaunted by our American standards, perhaps. I don't mean to say that unkindly, but we couldn't afford to build things like that in America
extra things
anymore.
in a building, right.
Exactly.
Right.
All the curves, all the angles, everything, for instance, you know, for aesthetics, perhaps as much as anything else. So, now if we go on inside the center, that's where we find some of the oldest books in the world. This is one of the first books in mathematics, geometry, and certainly, as I recall, certainly even beginning to look, for instance, you know, at the concept of the heliocentric theory as far as the Earth and planets moving around the sun. This predates Galileo, you know,
so this was kind of the unknown parts of history for many years because we didn't have interaction with the Earth.
Got it. You are exactly right. And so we have certainly this repository of these rare books. And so this was one of the first ones, a secular book. We've got this kind of backwards here, but this is a book, a picture, for instance, of drawings as far as Egypt is concerned. In about 1800, 1801. And if we'll go to the next slide, you can see why. There it is, and I hope we could bring this up. It's certainly the study of Egypt by Napoleon Bonaparte. And when he was in Egypt with his military, he just became fascinated by Egypt and the antiquities of Egypt, and then secondarily to find out that this was an Arab country which spoke in Arabic and, you know, practiced Islam. Well, he called for 200 of the greatest scholars and cartographers and the people who studied languages and mathematics, and to come to Egypt and to, you know, write about Egypt. And so they produced these huge books, 5 of which are left in the world, and one of them, here of all places, is in Riyadh, in King Faisal's Islamic Center. And it describes Egypt, but in so doing it begins to introduce the West, namely Europe, France, England, you know, Germany, eventually America, to the Arab world.
So that's when cultures really started mixing or finding out about each other, basically.
A few years after this, the Rosetta Stone, which was, you know, certainly captured by one of the lieutenants in Napoleon's army, for instance, will be unlocked, and then you're really on your way to understanding more about ancient Egypt, but also, for instance, the Arab world.
So even though that a couple hundred years ago exploring the Arab world, it continues today through trips such as yours, understanding the Arab world. That, you know, there's still a lot that people don't know about the Arab world.
It's a different world. That's all I can say when people ask me. I say it's just really a different world.
So, and you had a group of, as you said, professors, both men and women. I know you had you mentioned pictures. You have some people, as you say, dressed in the appropriate attire.
All the women, in our group had to dress, you know, in that attire. We had some students and graduate students. I had 2 working with me, and my goodness, we're way ahead of the time here.
This looks like a family shopping.
Yeah, this should be the last picture that we're looking at.
Okay, so kind of skipped ahead on the slideshow.
Yeah, we really did.
So I
think the next set of pictures that we would be looking at certainly would be not only the oldest copy of Quran, but also, for instance, you know, the work at the museum.
So a couple beyond this book, click forward a couple, we'll see what we have beyond this then.
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay, that's the exterior shot coming out. More of the architecture. Gosh, look at those buildings, see? And if we'll move on, I think that the next one,
This looks like drawings from a cave picture.
Exactly. How did you know, for instance, that France, with the ancient paintings on the cave walls in southern France, you know, would wind up in Arabia? But they have some of this in Arabia. going back 20,000 years as far as cave art is concerned, in order to show, for instance, how Saudi Arabia and that area of the world was also, part of Homo sapiens' earliest explorations as far as trying to express themselves. Honest to goodness, this is replicas, for instance, of the caves that they had close to the empty quarter in the southern part of
so the
Saudi
dawn
Arabia.
of civilization and man beginning from there as well.
Right.
It'd
It'd be close, for instance, to the bottom of the Red Sea. In that area where Sheba used to be, the Queen of Sheba, which is in Yemen. See, and so it's from that area. See, so we go on to the next slide then, and this is a remarkably fascinating model of a place that you and I can't get to. This is the mosque in Mecca, and this is the new mosque, which has created, for instance, all kinds of walkways, all kinds of abilities, for instance, to get to see to the Kaaba. The Kaaba is that main dark stone. You can see it in the middle, for instance, of the square here.
Right.
And this is a huge stone, a meteorite, which God hurled to the earth to get people's attention, and as a result to say that the last message is coming to the earth through Muhammad.
So this is at the model, at the actual mosque in Mecca.
That's right.
And this is, so they place a model in the Islamic Center to let you see what it looks like.
Exactly. Well said. That's exactly what they were doing in order for us to understand, for instance, the places that we can't go to because it's just restricted, of course, to practicing Muslims.
And we hear stories about the millions that go there. The crowds that go to Mecca each year.
Actually, about 2 million a year make the Hajj. That's the sacred trip. And in Islam, that's one of the 5 pillars of Islam, is you must, during your lifetime, make every effort to go to Mecca, to understand where God gave the last words that he's going to deliver to the people of the earth through Muhammad and Archangel Gabriel to the people of the earth. And in this regard, this is what Mecca is all about, because Mecca was Muhammad's hometown. And so his first effort was try to preach these words to the people of Mecca, and you'll find out that he suffered, terribly for that, because he was, a prophet in his own land is not. So, of course, the rest, becomes a future date where we'll look at this, but certainly it's how Islam started, was here in Mecca.
So you're getting a big, vast look at Saudi Arabia. We're talking about the economy, we're talking about the religious aspects, the society aspects.
Yes, we are. We're talking about the religion, the economy, the government, the society, and an awful lot, dealing with families and family relationships. And beginning with the royal family on down, for instance, the Lois family. So, yeah.
Now, in the pictures that you have, when you look at cities and pictures of the cities, they look very clean. I looked at some of your pictures.
Well, we've got one more slide here, and this is what the Kaaba, if we go back, looked like, in the past.
Okay.
We're going back to probably the turn of the 20th century.
So this is an early 20th century photo.
Oh, absolutely. See, and you can see the Kaaba dwarfs all the buildings and everything, and now the Kaaba is small in comparison to the way in which the mosque has been built up, and to accommodate 2 million people who must visit the Kaaba every year, reach in and touch if they possibly can, and have the appreciation for this huge stone inside, which represents God's mission to earth, and certainly the announcement of his last comings to earth. And so here, this photograph from 100 years ago compared to this model 100 years later, or more than that, for instance, make, I think, a nice startling contrast.
Show you how
and
much
then
it's
you
grown.
step outside and you see buildings like this. The angles on this building, we could not afford to build something like that in the United States. We wouldn't even want to. We'd see this as an excess, perhaps, maybe, as far as architect is concerned. But my God, it's got some pleasant, appealing aesthetics to it.
Now, people might be curious. You say we can't afford it. Who builds these buildings? Is it the Saudi government or the royal family? Or?
There's so much wealth in Saudi Arabia, and that's a good question. Most of them are built by independent individuals who have money. I think we were told we met at least 3 billionaires who visited with us, took us into their buildings, and certainly, I've never met a billionaire before. I never got to meet Sam Walton. Some people in the area have, but certainly I had to go halfway around the world to meet a billionaire. And my God, they were nice men. Humble and anything you have, and they treated us wonderfully well. I've never stayed in 5-star hotels repeatedly, and anything you want, just put it to the bill. And they treated us most graciously, because they were very interested in us and interested in us bringing back, for instance, to our locales, the view of Saudi Arabia that we have, or at least that they wanted us to have. So, yeah, I think we have a few more slides.
More slides to look at.
As far as architecture is concerned.
Showing the architecture.
They're just building that building. Here's the thing, Judy, and if we can change to the next slide, there. Look at that. Look at that round building. Wow. Who can afford to build a round building? The man that built that building is a billionaire, and he wanted to build it like an oil drum. You know, and I'll be darned if he didn't, you know, to say the least.
Gave an architect a challenge.
You know, we'll go on to the next slide then. There we go.
High
Out of the
rises.
middle of nowhere, we have high-rise buildings. We have high-rise commercial buildings. And the next slide, no, not quite. Now let's go back to the former slide. Here in all of the cities, Bahrain, certainly Mecca, but not Jeddah. Jeddah is an old-fashioned city, so you don't see too much of this in Jeddah. What you see in Jeddah is we'll see, for instance, a lot of art and certainly a lot of sculpturing and so forth. But here, out of the clear blue sky, you have a group of high-rise buildings, and then you go a little while, and then there's another group of high-rise buildings, and there's, you know, smaller buildings, and sometimes, certainly, of course, we'll see in some future slides some beautiful homes in between these. They don't have any city code. They don't
So
have
it's
any
not like
building
downtown
codes.
where all the high rises are and you go
We
out to the
are
outskirts.
exactly used to seeing that, you know, in America. Downtown Tulsa, downtown Dallas,
They have the
downtown
big
KC.
buildings there, and then you go out in the suburbs and
That's
it's
right.
not. Yeah.
They occur all over the place in Riyadh, Bahrain, for instance. You know, there's a set of high-rise over here. There's a set of high-rise over here. There's a set of high-rises here. And you, what is going on here? And you find out, well, they build them because they have the money and they want to build them
So
there.
you can literally live down the street from this big high-rise
That's
building.
right.
mixed
We
in
don't
with
have any
residential.
restricted codes. And so that gets a little, I mean, your mind thinks, what's going on here? Because we're so used to seeing it different here in the United States. And so just their cityscape, you know, grabs our attention
so
and
this
say,
looks a little
wow.
different than
And
I'm
so
used to.
every one of their buildings looks like it's kind of unique because it's architecture and it stands out there sort of one or two by themselves. And so you pay really much attention to it
Really.
rather than you do when they're all collected
When they're all together, you don't see that
in
difference.
Lower Manhattan or someplace.
Right.
See? Yeah. Okay.
Well, let's move on to the next slide. So we have some time still to look at those. They always have
that-
shopping malls as well.
The Mall of Bahrain. Now, recently we've heard ISIS say, you know, comment about the Mall of America and calling, for instance, for, you know, terrorism
malls and
attacks.
things.
I hate to use that word, but yeah, disturbance and so forth. Well, you think, okay, well, that's America. Man, the Mall of Bahrain, I think, might challenge, for instance, the Mall of America.
It looks like a
So
very
it's
impressive
like
structure
any
here.
other shopping mall. It's really clean, antiseptic, and look, you've got
Palm
all of
trees
this
inside the mall
all of
and
this
the
going
fancy-
on, palm trees inside the mall, and then let's stop and look at this. You have a fully covered, even her face, for instance, Arab woman looking at merchandise in this very, you know,
Expensive dressing
expensive
clothing store.
shop, clothing shop, and so forth. And it's just the incongruity of it is just delightful. I mean, you think, gosh, what's happening here? What could interest her, you know?
So they have the money to buy all these goods that are coming into their country and
they
being
really
able to
do.
spend that.
What's really impressive is you and I, we've kind of forgotten. I mean, America's moving away from wristwatches. Over there, wristwatches are in, and I'm talking about ones with jewels. I'm talking wristwatches which cost thousands of dollars.
So the jewelry is a big draw.
Oh, let me tell you, jewelry is a big draw, but you know, it's exclusive wristwatches, and you know.
And when
it's
you
a
look at these
wristwatch.
pictures, I mean, these look like very nice malls, very well
Very
kept
nice
and-
malls, and look, these are styles that are so Western. See, and you'll have, you know,
Let's go on to the
Saudi
next one and
women
see
after Saudi women moving past here, looking at this. See,
clothing that you would expect to find in any store here. And then-
absolutely, absolutely. See, and the incongruity of it is just, you know, sometimes overwhelming.
So you have two cultures mixing together even in fashions. They're being seen the Western fashion, but they're still wearing the traditional clothing.
You gotta love it. Look at that background. See, everything's swanky. Everything's it's the mall of all malls, and this Arab woman's there talking on a cell phone. You can only see her eyes, and it's such lovely incongruity. I mean, I just, you know, I know people that were with me said, "My God, what do we do in a shopping mall?" I said, "What can't we do in a shopping mall?" To me, this was, you know, one of the fascinating things of the trip to see, and we'll look at this again later on,
right.
this incongruity. So I
here's a
talked to
family.
him, yeah, and they're all out shopping. He says, "I am the proud father of 4 daughters," he said. And I said, "Well, you spend a lot of time shopping." He said, rolled his eyes, says, "Ah, yes, Allah be praised."
So their kids will grow up in shopping malls just like
They're growing up at shopping malls, and you know, his wife's in traditional dress, and it's just I guess it's like meeting the Pennsylvania Dutch. I'm in Pennsylvania on the highway somewhere like that. What are they doing here, and how does it work? You know, and so forth. But it is.
But they're still staying with the traditional Islamic heritage and clothing and culture and so forth as well, even though they have these Western influences with clothing.
Exactly. And the question raises itself, and there's a lot of speculation by people who write, study, and look at the Arab world, look at Saudi Arabia. Is this a harbinger of change? Will Saudi Arabia eventually become more like the West, or are they going to be able to hold out with their tradition as far as non-alcoholic, you know, deeply religious, women being covered, for instance, you know, and kids growing up the same way into the successive generations? Will this change when the line of kings move into the second or third generation of the Saudi family? Because the last king from the first king is on the throne now, and after he dies or leaves the throne, we'll be into the second, going to the third generations. And there's some real questions about that. You know,
the younger generation takes over. Are they going to keep what the older generation has instilled in the community?
Exactly. And there's dissidents in Saudi Arabia, and one of the things that Saudi Arabia did is repeatedly apologize to us, at least on several occasions, for 9/11, saying they recognize, you know, the feeling that we should have towards Saudi Arabia, because 15 of the 19 terrorists were Saudis.
Came from Saudi Arabia.
And they said they would have been criminals in our country. We would have had them in jail, or we would have had to treat them the same way you would, and we apologize for that. And they've been doing a lot in relationship to the United States since 2001 as far as buying more. And of course, the number one, for instance, the person or the country they want to trade with is the United States. Because they say, United States, things work, or United States will make them work.
So even though Europe's closer, we're still a bigger trading partner.
We are a bigger trading partner. They say we fulfill contracts, we deliver on time, and things work. And that's why, you know, they say, buy America first, which I was surprised at.
And of course, their oil that they are exporting goes to Europe as well as the United States.
Very much so, and they believe in cheap oil.
And so they're not fighting this drop in oil prices.
Not at all. In fact, they want to use it for political purposes. Number one, for the instability of Iran. Number two, for the instability of ISIS. And number three, to make us back off from fracking so much.
So slow down what we're doing in the United States as well. So ultimately affecting that.
Believe it.
Well, Dr. Gubera, I know there's so much more on the topic, and I appreciate you visiting with us today. For the audience, I want to let them know we're going to do some additional special programs airing on KGCS.
Are we already finished?
So they're giving me the signal that we're out of time for today.
Gosh, that went awfully fast.
But you know, I know we have other topics we can talk about. You know, more on the society, the culture, the politics, and we're going to follow up on those in other programs.
Well, I thank you very much, and I feel so fortunate to have been associated for the last 25 years with the National Council on U.S.-Arab Relations. I think this is about the 6th time that they've taken me pretty much on their money, for instance, into the Arab world. And so I really want to share more of these observations with you and get into perhaps maybe some of the keener points or the more salient points as far as Arab politics, religion, and relations with the United States.
Sure. I look forward to doing that.
Thank
you very much. And I'd like to thank you, the viewers, for joining us this week on Newsmakers. I'm Judy Stiles. I'll see you again next week at the same time on this station.